Joining us now to discuss is Lakai Vinson, criminal defense attorney and managing partner at Wood & Bowers Vinson. That's in Charlotte, North Carolina. Lakai, good to see you as always. Good morning. So talk to us a little bit about the significance of this testimony of police officers against Derek Chauvin regarding this trial so far. How has this been in your mind?
Good morning, Baker. Well, thank you for having me. As you shared, the blue wall of silence is the demonstration between the unwavering loyalty amongst officers and their unwillingness to testify against each other, regardless of the actions of the officer, whether they're right, wrong, or indifferent. But with the Chauvin case, we're seeing an unprecedented moment in which these officers are willing to testify against Chauvin. Now, this is certainly monumental for the Black and Brown community, who have often felt like that these officers have been able to hide behind this blue wall of silence and they're unwilling to testify about each other. And also, it's a shield of protection. But I believe that this opportunity signals to the communities at large that this blue wall of silence will not continue to be a shield for these officers when they commit egregious behavior. And I think that's certainly what we're seeing in this particular case. The former officer or the former supervisor of Chauvin has testified against Chauvin, of course. Also, the longest standing Minneapolis Police Department officer testified saying that this was not a part of any training that they've ever received to kneel on the neck of an individual for over 9 minutes. And you've also seen the police chief who's testified that once George Floyd was restrained, that the use of force should have stopped. So it's certainly not perhaps the first time, or the last time I should say, that we'll see something like this, but only time will tell whether or not this blue wall of silence is truly broken down, or if this is just an unprecedented moment due to the egregious behavior and the long-standing video that we have of Chauvin committing this potential crime against George Floyd.
Absolutely. And we've seen so many people coming out saying, listen, this was not part of his training whatsoever, even though that's what Derek Chauvin's defense is essentially arguing here. Do you feel like the overwhelming majority of law enforcement agrees that what Derek Chauvin did was not part of his police training?
Well, Baker, it certainly seems like it, just based on the fact that you had an officer get on the stand that was responsible for Chauvin's training that said, this is not something that we follow. This is not a part of our training that we typically do or we would typically approve. So I certainly think that it is going to influence this jury after having heard so many officers testify consistently with the fact that this use of force was uncalled for and was not a part of their police training.
We saw over the weekend that body camera footage of the incident that happened in Virginia, which was just abhorrent and appalling. Do you think now that because body camera footage has shown us what happened with George Floyd and what happened with Virginia over the weekend, that having the additional evidence essentially forces a lot of these officers to speak out against their other fellow officers who are doing something horrible?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which requires so many of us to stop, sit down for a moment, and really take the opportunity to observe America at large and determine what is happening in our country. And so when you have videos such as George Floyd and the incident that happened in Virginia, then it certainly makes a difference, because these officers can't deny what's plainly in front of their eyes and plainly in front of a potential jury's eyes and the communities at large.
What is your take so far on the defense's argument that George Floyd was using drugs as basically their way to cover Derek Chauvin's case in this particular regard? Do you feel that that is an effective strategy here?
Well, the difficulty with that strategy is, like you said, Baker, we have a videotape of Chauvin kneeling potentially on his neck or George Floyd's shoulder. That's an area of contention for over 9 minutes. So there's certainly some question about whether or not this strategy will be effective at all. But as a defense attorney, you have to take what you can get. And so the medical examiner said and agreed with the fact that George Floyd was taking drugs, that his drug use was a contribution towards his death. So I don't necessarily think it's going to be effective in the end, but I think if they have the ability to create reasonable doubt by talking about this drug use and pointing to the fact that this drug use was the reason George Floyd died, and they can do so by convincing just one juror on that particular jury pool, then they have done their job.
So let's talk about what you expect this week, Lakai. Obviously, the prosecution's probably going to wrap up likely this week. What are you looking forward to seeing this week, and what things should we be keeping on the horizon for this?
So up until last week, it's been expert after expert after expert talking about how George Floyd died, which is certainly important in this case because causation is a huge part of this case. What I expect from the defense is to put perhaps the fact witness or a couple of fact witnesses on the stand. We know there has been this individual that potentially sold drugs to George Floyd that does not want to testify, and his attorney has asked that he be released from his subpoena. So the question is whether or not this individual that is accused of selling drugs to George Floyd will take the stand, whether or not there are any other fact witnesses that support the defense, because we know up until this point, all of the officers so far have testified on behalf of the prosecution that we're keenly aware of. So from here, it's going to be the battle of the experts. Of course, the defense is going to put an expert on that says the reason George Floyd died was because of his drug use and his underlying health condition, not the actions of Chauvin. And then from there, the big question is, will Chauvin take the stand? Only time will tell. It's a hard question to be answered when you're dealing with it on the defense side. And it's always scary to put your defendant on the stand because you just don't know what they're going to say. But we'll be keeping our eyes open to see if Chauvin is going to take the stand, but I doubt it.
All right. Lakai Vinson, always a pleasure to have your insights on this show this morning. Thank you, as always, criminal defense attorney in North Carolina.